Greetings Internet folks, Daniel here, back again with another world building video on Driving and Dragons. New driving and 280ZX restoration footage is coming soon as we move through the holiday season, but for now it's just going to be some of the old hits. What about your table? Any great Christmas or Christmas adjacent sessions taking place? Let me know in the comments below right after you like, subscribe, and share the video. It would really mean a lot to the channel. Now buckle up, this is going to be a long one. Last time I put in my 2 cents on clerics and other religious characters in TTRPGs and how we often screw them up by either thinking about them mechanically or by looking at them entirely through a postmodern lens. There I focused on religion and how we approach it on the character level. Today we look at religions as a cultural aspect of a complete setting or world. When developing a new setting, a game master has it a lot harder than a fiction writer for the most part. Certainly a hard sci-fi writer will face the inevitable challenge of sci-fi nerds testing just how quote-unquote hard the science is to an almost nauseating extent, and fantasy writers, they'll often box themselves into corners where whatever society they're emulating meets the very real concern of why would this ever be a thing in a world with XYZ magic. But they have a couple of key advantages over the game master. Namely, they can easily retcon whatever they need in their rough draft to shore up the final product, and they also have absolute control over every being and creature in the universe, so they never have to worry about their main protagonist stopping in the middle of a scene to poke holes in their narrative or to pick out little idiosyncrasies. This rears its ugly head in a very subtle way when it comes to the religions and faiths that are found in your game world, because it doesn't come up as a player outright challenging something or a major hiccup in the flow of the game. It most often is just a weird feeling that something is just off, and that pulls players subconsciously out of the game. At best, it just becomes a window dressing for a mechanic or a palette swap for a generic cult faction. Neither of these are great for your game, and they really are a serious defect, especially if you're trying to develop some kind of setting for use by others. Now let's start by running through a few broad strokes as it pertains to theological systems, specifically for tabletop role-playing game worlds. First is the presence of divine figures in the world itself. Is this a world or universe where gods literally walk on the earth itself? Can powerful religious adherents open a portal and climb the proverbial stairway to heaven and physically enter the court of their divine patron? Chances are atheists and agnostics are not going to be a thing in your world, nor will relativistic views of anything that stems from or is embodied by said divine beings. On the flip side, if your divine powers take a more hands-off, invisible form of interaction with the world, it is likely that anything attributed to one god by one culture may and likely would be instead attributed to some other figure by another. Also, when culturally and developmentally appropriate, egocentric and a-religious societies are more likely to become a thing as we grow throughout our development as a sentient species. Next is the structure of the divine itself. Do the gods actually exist in your world? If not, where do religiously inclined character types get their powers and abilities? Is your world polytheistic? Is it monotheistic? Dualistic? Spiritualist? Is it a combination of several? Is it multi-theistic and composed of all of the above, with every culture arguing over who is right or who is wrong? Are they bound to our cosmology? Are they trapped outside of it? Are they something in between? In the TTRPG sense, mechanics also have to be considered. Are spells or abilities tied to religion? Are there spells or abilities that must be altered in one way or another in order for them to work and to fit with the way your world's divine cosmology works? Lastly, in a way most importantly, how and why has religion developed in the way it has in your world? Different societies develop different religions in different ways based on what is important and relevant to their cultures in the real world, and this makes sense when we deal with the more hands-off, nebulous, unmoved movers. However, when your universe is populated by gods who literally speak to their supplicants or who physically appear before the general populace, culture will be influenced by the gods as opposed to the worship of the divine being informed by the culture. To world build religions, you have to ask and answer these questions, and sometimes it can be a pretty daunting task, and luckily I've got some tips and tricks handy to help you out with that. Start with the same thing every world building project should start with: your theme. Your choices regarding religion in your game world should be in service to enhancing your theme. This doesn't mean that you can't subvert some expectations, but you have to proceed with deliberate care when you subvert those expectations. Objective, irrefutable, direct evidence of the existence of divine beings, let alone having divine beings that overtly and directly involve themselves in the affairs of the world, are going to heavily influence the cultures of that world. It's a lot like the whole combat wheelchair nonsense in Dungeons and Dragons. Combat wheelchairs would never be a thing in a D&D world for around 1,000 different reasons. But one of the biggest is that in a world where any injury can be instantaneously and completely healed by a priest or cleric, there would never be a need to invent a wheelchair, period, let alone a combat wheelchair. However, in, say, Cyberpunk Red, the cybernetic netrunner chairs and leg replacements do make sense in a world where it's just a natural advancement of prosthetics. The same is true with religions and their impact on cultural development. Always consult your theme, then take the time to ask if something fits, and if so, how would it change the world around your characters. My personal advice is that, as a general rule of thumb, you should figure out the overall vibe you want and select religious systems that enhance that feeling, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel in order to have that quirky sci-fi setting where animism is the primary theology. And that does seem like a good segue into a quick rundown of the different kinds of theological systems. First is loose polytheism. Loose polytheism. Polytheism is a funny thing. We think it's simple, but it really isn't, especially in fantasy TTRPGs. We end up with a lot of dysfunctional pantheons, largely because of that pesky, the gods are objectively proven and present in the world, so this doesn't make sense thing. What's funny is that a more realistic take would actually work better across the board here. A loose polytheism, or a loose pantheon, refers to a system of gods who exist independently. D&D is classically a loose pantheon where all the gods act independently within their domains. A loose pantheon gives you a decent amount of freedom and laxity and works reasonably well in fantasy games. It gives the ability for gods to be acknowledged while still retaining a I pray to the four winds and the everlasting sky / Crom laughs at your four winds from his mountains dynamic. However, your warrior gods and more esoteric figures are either going to be relegated to minor figures or have other aspects to them as well. Why? Because most people in a loose pantheon system are going to pay homage to whatever gods most directly impact their lives. Farmers and poor villagers likely don't know a warrior god unless it is out of fear of their symbols. They don't adventure or fight, and if they do go to war, it usually isn't by choice and forces them to leave their entire life behind. These people are going to be focused on agriculture, weather, the sun and the moon, and possibly some local minor deities related to whatever trades or natural features are most important to the area. And that touches on another great advantage of a loose polytheistic system. Multiple gods for just about everything. There's no reason a temperate climate culture can't have a kind and life-giving sun god, while a desert culture has a sun god who is brutal and unforgiving as a judge. Loose polytheism is also very incongruent with modern and futuristic settings. As technology advances, man gains more and more control over the aspects of his life that he used to worship gods for. Even more so in a world where the gods are largely subtle and a matter of faith. As knowledge grows and more is understood, these gods become seen more as myth and figment than actual beings. Because once you understand that the world orbits the sun and the sun doesn't travel through the sky, it becomes less likely that you will believe in a god with a magic chariot who pulls it from east to west every day. It can set up some fun, holy shit, he's real type surprises and adventures. In fact, the entire Call of Cthulhu mythos dances in this space up to and including mechanics that make it harder to believe in or use certain magics unless your intelligence is lower, representing the idea that more rational minds are going to seek out more rational explanations and not be as faith-driven and as open to the spiritual. Second out is going to be a structured polytheism, where a loose polytheism represents a multitude of gods doing things independently on their own. Structured pantheons are just that, actual pantheons. Pantheons aren't just collections of gods, they are structured religious hierarchies of multiple gods forming a single religion, wherein a loose pantheon or loose polytheism various people in the same culture may worship different gods while being merely respectful, if not indifferent, to others. In structured pantheons, they are generally worshipped as a whole, with each god playing his own distinct role, with the common folk who will routinely invoke whichever god is appropriate to the situation. Some benefits to the structured polytheism is you typically need fewer gods. The more powerful or further up the hierarchy, the more broad their domain, with lesser aspects being assigned to other things in the world, like spirits or fae. It also helps a lot with more modern settings, as they generally follow an evolutionary narrative, be it death and rebirth, light and dark, etc., which can be expanded out to cover as more science develops. They do run short with other cultures coming into contact with each other. To reference my other example, life-giving, kind, and loving sun god doesn't make a lot of sense in the brutal savannah, and this can be handled by different cultures giving praise to different aspects of a deity, even by different names, but we'll talk about that a little later. Monotheism is in some ways an easy way out, and in some ways a tremendous amount of work that most game masters don't consider. For one, there is a single all-powerful deity that is unopposed and directly active in your world. Why are there opposing religious factions, and to what extent do they oppose one another? Doesn't really make sense when there's just one God and we all know it because he's there. Also, who would ever seek to oppose such a being? It's one thing for people to sin when God works in mysterious ways and God gave us free will, but he also gave us a path out. It's quite another to go covet thy neighbor's wife when Big G is literally posted up just outside the town saying, don't do that from your flaming kitchen window succulent plants, and his priests are dropping searing fire on people in the streets. It also has a profound effect on your modern day settings and near future settings. Monotheism, particularly global monotheism, is, to make it work in a modern culture is pretty tough. There are always unknowns and unprovable, and an unknown knower or unmoved mover is an easy concept for hyper-rational, scientifically minded culture to accept. So monotheism is a lot easier to deal with when it comes to your near future and your current day type stuff. But when you have a monotheism where there's really no question about there being just one God, period, end of story, and he's very much in the world, you have to ask yourself why these cultures didn't form into a single culture that essentially worships at the feet of that one God, doing exactly what he says, because really hard to kind of buck the system when the system is an omnipresent and omnipotent, powerful figure that actually gives a shit about what you do. Dualism is the fourth flavor of the day. Dualism is exactly what it sounds like. Virtually everything is split into opposites, with a deity or aspect of a single deity representing each side. Light, dark, good, evil, night, day, life, death, etc., etc., etc. Dualistic cultures tend to lend themselves pretty well to spiritualism, and they lend themselves well to epic fantasy adventures as well as bizarre modern cults. Dualism is also fertile ground for more free-form nebulous religions. GM does have to consider how it impacts any religiously restricted class features and character abilities. Much like monotheism, it gets a bit dicey when a player gets his powers from a god that covers half of everything or covers absolutely everything, but then you tell him he has to pick two specific domains and there are many things that are mutually exclusive. Sure, you can talk about specialization and needing to focus on certain training, but in the end, it kind of feels like an arbitrary restriction that pulls you out of the game world when my God is the God of everything, and you tell me that I have to pick two specific subjects and there's two of them that are mutually exclusive. Why can I not pick both of these things when my God is the God of both of them? Lastly is what I'm going to call spiritualism. And I'm not talking about what is basically a hippie version of atheism with spirit crystals, vibes, yoga classes at the Y, and drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. I mean actual spirit worship, ranging from animism, where animal spirits and totems are the main thing, to the kind of Shinto or Taoist concept of everything being tied together to a greater whole as either wholly independent spirits or individual aspects of some greater spirit or energy. This is another one of those easy modes that can get you into a lot of trouble if you aren't careful with your world building. Literally everything has a governing spirit, and typically the more refined the aspect, the lesser the spirit. So for example, a spirit of an ocean will be far more powerful and removed from humanity than the spirit of a current, which is in turn greater than the spirit of a wave and the spirit of the foam on that wave. These can all be parts of the same greater spirit, or they can be truly independent beings. This kind of religion actually works well in just about any setting or genre, but it can be particularly vexing when trying to build large religious entities that are beyond like a small monastery that make sense. And it's even worse when you get that player who likes to find ways to cheese his abilities by digging through everything under the sun, literally, until he finds the spirit of something that just so happens to make perfect sense, granting powers in two normally exclusive areas that is intentionally game-breaking. Think of it kind of like alignment. As a game mechanic, alignment can't be based on individual perspective. It's all good and well until the Paladin can suddenly smite everyone because his definition of evil conveniently translates into not me. And his code is perfectly acceptable to fight dishonorably if you're fighting dishonorable people, so he took some rogue levels to get that sweet smiting sneak attack, all without violating his own personal perspective of what lawful good means. This same kind of munchkin cheese can happen when faith is tied to in-game abilities and you just so happen to have a religious system that allows players to draw their power from whatever they like, especially when what they like is to have a combination of divine abilities that were originally designed to exclude each other. This video, like I said, it's getting to be a little bit long, so I'm going to be breaking it up into several different breakdowns of how to use each of these theologies effectively in your world building. But I'm going to cover one more topic on religions in your games here. That one is being a key decision that you have to make, particularly if your game has abilities tied to the divine, and that is, what is the nature of divinity in your world? Determining the nature of divinity is just really answering a series of questions. Do gods exist in your world? If so, how many? Do the society of the worlds recognize this reality? In other words, are they quote-unquote polytheistic, but the universe is actually a monotheistic system, and they are simply worshiping various aspects of it, or spiritualists, and each culture, the gods are simply the strongest spirits in their orbit. In other words, they view themselves as polytheistic, worshiping many gods, but what they're really worshiping is the powerful spirits in their area, or that one god, because it's either a spiritualist system or monotheistic, respectively. Do your gods occupy the same reality as your PCs? Can you go visit them with some kind of plane shift ability, or are they truly apart from the cosmos your game exists in? Is divinity and divine power innate and eternal, or is it something that can be gained or lost, say by having a certain number of worshippers, or by tapping into some kind of ley line or power cosmic or something? Do the gods have limits to their omnipotence? Can they be killed? How do they impart their powers and abilities to their followers, and what do they require in exchange for those powers? These things all factor in to the nature of divinity, And they are the kind of thing you have to start with. You have to know, what is the truth? Is my system truly monotheistic despite what the characters in the world believe and the cultures have developed around? Or is there no question about it? It's monotheistic because the one God has come out and been the one God in front of everybody. And can you replace that God? Is there a way to kill him and take his place? Or is there some other power you can steal from him to make yourself more powerful? These are the kind of things you have to know when you start developing everything. And these are the kind of questions that we will cover in the next several World Builder University videos, which I think I'm going to group together as our first 200 level lectures. So World Building 201 or 202. In the meantime, tell me what you think about religion in TTRPG worlds in the comments below. And please take a minute to help the channel out by giving us a like and sharing this video